If you'd like to download this preset, it's available in my Sounds You Know Volume 2 preset pack. The link for that's available in the video description. To get started, let's initialize preset. That gives us this. Let's lower it to the bass octave. Let's change the shape to a square wave. And then let's do pulse width modulation. This is going to make it a little bit thinner. So it starts off here. I think it sounds good somewhere around 45%. Let's add in a filter. Make it 24 decibel and remove the resonance. Lower the cutoff. And then let's modulate that cutoff with an envelope. Let's lower that modulation amount. Sounds good to me. Let's go over to the effects and let's turn on the EQ. And let's give it a little bump. And let's set that bump to about, I'm going to make sure this is in hertz. I'm going to set this to about, let's say 180. I'm going to increase the resonance a little and lower this just a tad. That sounds better to me. I'm going to lower voices to 1 so I can only play one note at a time. Now let's make this a little bit more realistic and playable. So one thing I want to do is make it velocity sensitive so that when I hit the keyboard harder, I get a stronger pluck sound. So one thing we can do is just drag velocity over to this modulation here so that higher velocities get more filter cutoff modulation. But those low velocities, they're a little bit too weak. So I want there to be a minimum amount of modulation. So I can go to the matrix here. X-axis is velocity, y-axis is modulation amount. So now at 0 velocity, I at least have 50% modulation. So those lower velocities still sound like a bass. Now another thing I can do is mimic the way that an actual bass player plays a bass. Usually they play with 2 different fingers and they alternate those fingers. And we can do something really cool that's unique to Vital with this point cycle LFO mode. So I'm going to set this to a saw up shape. Oops. And then I'm going to set the Y grid to 2 so I can put another point here. So this point cycle modulation mode will basically modulate between the points that I've set on this LFO. And if I set the tempo down to freeze, it's going to jump from this one to this one. So check it out. If I hold shift and drag this over to pulse, listen to what happens. You can see it's jumping from this to this, every other note. So it's triggered by the note. And I could put however many of these I want, but since bass players usually only play with 2 fingers, I only want 2 points. Now, this is too much modulation. I'm going to lower this quite a bit, maybe to about, let's say, 0.1, or even a little less. Now, it's very subtle, but you can hear a tiny difference between every other note, which is what would naturally happen with a real bass player, especially if they're playing fast. Now, I can also introduce just a little bit of randomness because a bass player isn't going to be 100% precise with how they're hitting the string every single time. So we can introduce that randomness to pulse width modulation, and we can do it to filter cutoff as well. So this random modulator is going to give us a random amount every time we play a note. So this is going to be too much. So I'm going to reduce this quite a bit. So like 0.015, just to make sure that the notes aren't always the same. Same thing for the cutoff. I'm going to hold shift and drag it over. Then I'm going to set this to, let's say, 2. So now there's just a little bit of randomness to make it a little bit more realistic. Now, one thing I could do is actually add some reverb. And I know what you're thinking. Reverb on a bass is a no-no. But if we decrease the size quite a bit and the time quite a bit, check it out. You know, that kind of sounds like a bass from like next door or something. Now, you don't want too much of that. I think that's a bit too much, but maybe something like 20%, 15% of a really short reverb can really sell it as like an actual acoustic sound that you're hearing in a space versus a synthesized one. So one other thing we need to do, this isn't going to sustain forever, so I'm going to lower sustain down to 0 and give it a generous amount of decay time, maybe like 11 seconds. So that if I were to sustain this note, it would eventually die out. Now, one other thing I can do to make this even more realistic is modulate this slope here. Because if I pluck the string harder, the slope's going to be more like this. If I pluck it softer, it's going to be more like this. Now we're emulating that with velocity, and we can modulate that shape by modulating this morph here in the matrix. So modulation 1 is envelope 2 to filter 1 cutoff. If I drag this over here and I make it negative, then higher velocities will have a steeper slope. That's too much. It's basically like this. It sounds like a muted bass. So let's decrease this amount to maybe like -1. That's maybe a little bit too subtle, so -2. I think that's a little bit more believable. So that's basically just modulating that maybe like that much, which is all we really need. So anyways, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.